Welcome to the TradGard Wica podcast. This podcast is for both seekers and initiates of the Gardnerian path, and focuses on historical contexts as well as modern-day concerns. All contributors are either elders, high priests, or high priestesses of the traditional Gardnerian Wica, some with several decades in the craft. Our guest today is a Gardnerian high priest with over 40 years of experience in our tradition, High Priest O'Loran. He serves the tradition both as a coven leader and as a lecturer on Gardnerian topics. In the first half of this two-part episode, we explore both the historical and magical roots of Gerald B. Gardner, the founder of the Gardnerian tradition.
Thank you so much for having me on this podcast. My craft name is O'Loran, and I've been practicing Gardnerian craft for over 40 years, a short time really in the scheme of things, and I hope to give you a sense of who Gerald Gardner was, speak briefly about some of his associates, and touch on the practice of traditional Gardnerian craft. Because our time together is so short, I'm going to try to be concise and cover many years of history. I'll be referencing things about Gerald Gardner and the tradition which we know, as well as other things where we can only speculate because of the paucity of the data. In any case, I want to state at the outset that what is spoken of here in this venue comes from many sources, and I hope that you will publish the bibliography of referenced works on your website so that those who have greater curiosity can research my statements for themselves. When examining the Gardnerian tradition, it's important to examine the historical context within which our tradition arose. I'll be giving some amount of history, which you may find extraneous, but I hope you hang in there with me, as there's a method to the madness in painting a picture of the people and events surrounding Gerald Gardner and the manifestation of Gardnerian craft.
That's great, thank you. We will make sure to link the bibliography to the episode directly. So, where do you feel we should start when it comes to the history of the craft?
First, the practice of witchcraft was illegal in England until 1951 with the passage of the Fraudulent Mediums Act, which focused upon premeditated deception. This was updated in 2008 with the Consumer Protection from Unfair Trading Regulations. In the United States, we have a difficult time thinking about spiritual practices as being illegal. But 70 years ago, it was a different time in England. Even back into the 60s and 1970s, you could be fired for your religious practices or have a brick thrown through your front window. In 1542, Parliament passed the Witchcraft Act, which made it a crime to practice witchcraft up to punishment by death. This was repealed 5 years later, but was restored in 1562. A further law was passed in 1604 under James I, who was obsessed with demons and evils of all sorts. One of the things which occurred in England was the institution of governmental courts versus church courts. This at least gave some separation between religious zealots conducting trials in a formal governmental legal process. Witches were hanged in England, not burned as they had been on the continent. In Scotland, witches were burned, but they were strangled first, which I'm sure gave them great solace. So someone could be convicted of witchcraft in a court and placed in jail for a year, as well as having their property forfeited. A second conviction could result in being sentenced to death.
And what would you say is the main reason this fear led to persecutions?
What was being targeted were magical practices, the making of talismans or charms, divination of the future, or to find what was causing ill luck, or the distribution or prescribing of herbs to treat common ailments. What really caused the authorities the greatest fear was malefica, that is, the working of negative magic to kill or harm another through magical means, or to harm their property, crops, livestock, homes, that kind of thing. The use of magical means to affect political structure was feared even more by those with power. These were magical practices which they certainly did not approve of. England had, and still has, a state religion, the Anglican Church, which was supported by the power of the monarchy. The framework that the Church uses to view these practices was that illicit magic was the result of evil demons deceiving the practitioner. It's all the work of the devil. Now, this framing of magic goes back in the early centuries of the Catholic Church, who, as they were fighting paganism, cast all things they did not approve of as the work of the devil and as evil. So think about that for a moment. Think about how many people live in the county where you are hearing this podcast. How many people would need to be put in jail for a year, publicly hanged, to convey the message from authorities that what you may be doing could cause your death? Not many, I would suspect, as bad news never waits. Good news waits, but bad news travels fast. And this would be bad news indeed.
When did the hangings and burnings in England finally end?
Janet Horne was the last person to be killed for witchcraft in 1727. She and her daughter were imprisoned following charges from neighbors. Witch trials continued into the 1700s. The attitude towards witchcraft changed over time with the integration of scientific thought into elite culture, so that magic and witchcraft were seen as an irrational delusion or superstition of the common folk, rather than as a demonic plague upon society. Rationality became the order of the day, so what was considered accomplished by magic in the past was then considered fraud perpetrated by the criminal upon the unsuspecting. The gullible public then needed to be protected from this deception by the power of the state, and so astrology, fortune-telling, or divination, or magic in general, was considered fraud. By the time Gerald Gardner comes along over 200 years after the last execution, witchcraft was still illegal. It was just that people weren't being killed over charges of its practice. So that's the first thing to consider, the legal angle. The second thing to consider are the actual practices, the behavior of people on the ground and the community. After all, we have this Christian monotheistic worldview that magic is the result of deception by the devil, and that it's promulgated by the clerics, the church, and the elite. But that's not necessarily what the people believe, nor is it necessarily how they live their everyday lives. So the second thing to focus on is the cunning craft tradition. That is, there was a thriving practice of people making money, selling charms, conducting divination, providing magic, and the basic health care in villages all over the British Isles. This was also occurring in cities as well, as can be seen through the widespread popularity, for example, of astrological consultation in metropolitan areas. It must be remembered that neither health care nor justice was widely available in rural areas, so people just had to make do. This meant using midwives for childbirth, going to the village cunning man or woman for herbal cures, or to discover why your milk was souring, or who the thief was who stole your sheep. To use a water witch or dowser to find the best location to dig a well for fresh water. A great deal of this cunning craft tradition was tied into the fairy faith, that is, the belief in spirits associated with the land in a proximal parallel world to our own, who could be accessed to gain spiritual helpers, familiars, or powers not accessible to the common person. It was a faith rooted to relationship with these spirits to mutual benefit. Sometimes these relationships were even passed down in families. Fairy beings were certainly ambivalent. They could help or hurt depending upon your relationship with them. But this was also true of the cunning person. They could blast or heal, because it always has been true that those who can heal can always do harm, but those who can do harm cannot always heal. The belief in the fairy world would decline with the advent of industrialization, the movement off of farms and into cities for employment. Factory work and production takes place of agriculture for employment, and with this change we get both the blessings and the curse of the modern world. The blessings of technology and the labor savings it provides, along with a de-enchantment of the environment, which brings us into our current atheistic, materialistic worldview, dominated by a reductionistical, logical positivism science. An economic view of the earth is something to be used and exploited as a resource, not as a matrix of life within which we all have to live. And so it is into this transition from the old world of agriculture and into the new world of industry that Gerald Gardner steps into, returning to England from his retirement from the Far East.
How well did Gerald understand agriculture, though, coming from an industrial nation?
Gerald certainly understood agriculture, from staying in the south of France to visiting the Canary Islands yearly, to growing up around the tea plantations of Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, to working as a customs official in the Far East inspecting opium shops, on rubber plantations of Borneo, and in Johor in Malaysia. So Gerald spent many years in Borneo and Singapore. During this period, he became acquainted with the spiritualism and magic of the local populations, the Malays, the Senoi, as well as that of Borneo. This would do him well when he returned to England, for spiritualism certainly had taken root there, and not to the liking of the clerical authorities. But times had changed with the coming of industrialization, and the Church's authority, while still official, had lost the ability to suppress spiritual practices it didn't like. Now, when Gerald returned to England for a visit in 1927, he quickly made contact with the spiritualist community in London. It was during this visit that Gerald met his wife Donna, who was working as a nurse.
What were some of the additional influences on Gerald in relation to spiritualism?
We know that in addition to his interest in spiritualism and the magic of the Far East, Gerald met and worked with Flinders Petrie, one of the most prominent archaeologists of the time. Gerald toured some of the sites in Egypt and worked with Petrie for several weeks on excavations in Gaza. Petrie had been working in the field for decades by the time Gerald met and worked with him. Petrie was conversant with all periods of Egyptian history, from the ancient pre-dynastic through the medieval period. Magic was part and parcel of Egyptian society, at least until the late Roman, early Christian period. When Petrie landed in Egypt in 1879, he felt that the destruction of the ancient culture was like a house on fire, and that it was his job to salvage as much as he could. Sound familiar? This appears to be the same impression Gerald had when encountering the witch cult in 1939. In addition to doing archaeological field work in the Middle East, is not easy work, especially for someone with asthma. It wasn't like he could just pop into an air-conditioned cinema for relief. I often have wondered during this period of life how debilitated he really was. You can tell by just this brief summary that Gerald was a voraciously curious man, especially regarding the esoteric, and we haven't even touched on Gerald's visits to Cambodia, Vietnam, China, Turkey, and Hungary, nor have we touched on his Masonic background. It isn't as if Gerald was just dabbling on the surface of things after all. He was conversant enough with Malay culture, for example, to have written the definitive text on the kris and other Malay weapons, the kris being a general, special Malay knife. If you read that book, you quickly get the impression that Gerald was not only familiar with the weapon and its martial uses, but he was quite familiar with its magical uses as well. It is my suspicion that Gerald, far from being a surface observer, was in fact integrating all of his experiences into a world view which was appreciative of the esoteric and very sensitive to its subtleties. Now, we know that Gerald considered himself a patriot, joining the Home Guard during the Second World War, but he was also involved with the Malay States Volunteer Rifles during World War I while in the Far East. Gerald was familiar with weapons and their use. From a Gardnerian perspective, I believe that it was the local practice of magic which affected Gerald the most, watching the Malay and Senoi conducting divinations, providing healings, and raising energy through dance. Understanding that the life force pervades all things, and that this is the same force which is generated from the body of the witch when working magic. I suspect that there were other embodied traditions which Gerald ran across during his career and travels. When Gerald returned to England in 1936, retiring at the age of 52, it's also documented that he was socializing with accomplished authorities in many fields, such as the architect Holgar Jacobson, an expert in historical weapons, such as the flintlock and historical knives; James Laver, an employee of the Victoria and Albert Museum, who was an expert in costume and fashion and an acquaintance of Aleister Crowley; Cody Burland, a curator of ethnography of the British Museum, an expert on quote-unquote primitive art, and the author of books on magic, alchemy, and seasonal festivals; Alexander Kyler, an archaeologist who helped to study and preserve the standing stones at Avebury; and who founded the Morven Institute of Archaeological Research. Jaquetta Hawkes, an archaeologist who worked on digs in Palestine and Ireland and who wrote on prehistoric Britain, and in the book, quote, Dawn of the Gods, suggested that the Minoans may have been ruled by women. J.S.M. Ward, an authority on Chinese secret societies, a Masonic scholar and creator of the historic Abbey Folk Park, and a priest of the Old Catholic Church. And lastly, Abbé Brule, an expert on prehistoric cave art. Even following his initiation into the craft, Gerald continued to read widely. It's clear that he was familiar with the work of Arthur Avalon, the pseudonym of Sir John Woodruff, focusing on the Hindu Chantras, and the work of Carl Jung and his followers focused on depth psychology, as well as the work of Plato and Plotinus. This is specialized literature. It's hard going, certainly much harder going than any Wica 101 book that you would run across. And to me, Gerald was seeking deeply for the connections between cultures and looking for the historical flow of ideas associated with religion, myth, and magic.
So you have focused a lot on Gardner's history and intersection with spiritualism through culture and through other spiritualists. Why do you feel this is important for understanding Gardner?
Why do I bother with all these details? Well, it's because we get the impression from Gerald that he quote-unquote stumbled upon the witch cult in the New Forest, but clearly there is no stumbling here at all. Gerald was adventurous. He made a conscious effort over many years to actively seek out and socialize with diverse experts in the areas he lived in. He went out of his way to work with and get to know experts far afield. These were elites, all of them, whether in the jungle of the Far East or in the urban areas of England and Europe. This is who Gerald was. It was part of his character, an insatiably curious fellow who was always working, synthesizing, thinking, and probably experimenting as well. He was attracted to others who were adventurous, and he lived these adventures all before he wrote any of his books. Note that we haven't even touched on his more explored acquaintances with Aleister Crowley, Margaret Murray, and the Druid Ross Nichols. These relationships, too, follow Gerald's pattern of seeking out experts in their field. Gerald joined the Folklore Society in 1939, as it was involved with them for another 20 years. Gerald's interest in folklore was certainly long-standing. We also know that when visiting England in 1928, Gerald applied for a reader's card at the British Library to study Basque and Welsh folklore. Gerald loved sunbathing, and he spent time socializing at the Spielplatz Sun Club with Ross Nichols, the founder of the Order of Bards, Oviates, and Druids. Following this, he bought an interest in the 5 Acres Sun Club, where he socialized with James Laver, Cotty Burland, and Arnold Crowther, who were also members. Gerald's interests and social activities were wide-ranging indeed. Because many authors focus on Gerald's late-in-life activities, we are also led to believe he was just an old, infirm, and asthmatic man. And it's true that Gerald struggled with asthma all his life. It may have been what ultimately killed him. However, we know he pushed against its limits. I mention this because, as the Second World War was approaching in 1938, Gerald was digging trenches in Hyde Park as part of the war effort, certainly not the work of the infirm. Gerald and Donna relocated to Highcliffe in 1938, and he was taking bicycle rides around the area exploring. These are not the activities of an infirm man. If he could dig ditches and bicycle around, he could certainly dance around a circle. We do know that by 1947, however, Gerald's asthma was so bad that he was having difficulty walking upstairs. And this is the Gerald that most people focus upon. In 1940, Gerald was volunteering to be an air raid precautions warden in his new area as part of the efforts to contribute to the war effort. Gerald wanted to join the Home Guard and was initially rejected, maybe because of his age. Not allowing circumstances to stop him, he had made contact with the local head of the Highcliffe Home Guard and got himself recruited as an armorer. This in violation of the regulations regarding wardens not being permitted to be armed. From my point of view, this is typical Gerald. being proactive, reaching out to the person in authority with expertise, forming a relationship, and getting where he wanted to be, all in service of the greater good. Now, politically, Gerald was a fairly conservative fellow. Interestingly, Major Frederick Fish, the local head of the Home Guard, was not, but he was considered left-wing, supporting the Republicans in the Spanish Civil War. But Gerald got along with him, another trait I think would be important to point out in Gerald's character.
This is interesting. Based on what I know of history, Gerald seemed pretty fluid in terms of political association, even if he was right of center himself. What do you feel that says about him as an individual and as a practitioner?
He was what we would call a people person. He could get along with others of markedly different political viewpoints in service of a greater goal. We will see this played out later in Gerald's life when he was able to work with Doreen Valiente, who was left of center, and whose husband probably had PTSD from action seen during the Spanish Civil War. In fact, we can see the same pattern even later in Gardnerian history with Doreen and Patricia Crowther, who is conservative, working together following Gerald's death, becoming friends and working in common cause, supporting the tradition they loved. I believe this is true because their spirituality drove their politics. Their politics did not drive their spirituality. And because their spirituality became front and center, they were able to get along with those with whom they differed politically. But back to Gerald. It was in Highcliffe that Gerald discovered the amateur Rosicrucian theater, attended its performances, such as a play focused on Pythagoras, and met the group involved in its productions. The members he was most attracted to were those most serious about the cult. Of course, I would expect nothing less of Gerald. Some of these were members of the Crotona Fellowship. The Crotona Fellowship was an esoterically based group which believed in the immortality of the soul, reincarnation, and the developing of natural psychic powers of the individual in order to make spiritual progress. These people were working class but well-read. We are talking about the Mason family, Edith Woodford Grimes, called Daffo by Gerald, and most likely the source of Gerald's initiation into the craft. Now, the Mason family, who moved to Highcliffe in 1922, appears to be interested in a number of esoteric movements, the first being Theosophy, which was started and popularized by Helena Blavatsky and was very popular in England and around the world. In fact, it could be argued that the Theosophical movement supported the occult revival in England in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and in addition to supporting prominent astrologers in England, such as Alan Leo, who was arrested twice for fortune-telling, Walter Garnold, who wrote under the name Safariel, Dane Rudhyar, and John Adley, who founded the Urania Trust. The Theosophical Society was set up in 1875 to study comparative religion, philosophy, and science, to explore occult laws and human powers, and to foster a universal brotherhood regardless of race, sex, caste, and creed. Pretty progressive for its time.
How easy or not easy was it to find these Theosophical societies?
There were Theosophical lodges all over the world. Most major cities had one. Some small towns had them too. They would be a safe place for free thinkers and those interested in the esoteric to meet and discuss different worldviews. You could go to these lodges and hear lectures on many topics: reincarnation, meditation, auras, interfaith belief, developing mystical powers, enlightened masters, exploring cosmic evolution, astrology, tarot, Indian philosophy, Buddhism, Jainism, spiritual helpers, yoga, and it goes on and on. These lodges still provide lectures and exist today. You could do an entire podcast on the importance of the Theosophical Society to the occult revival. In any case, back to the Mason family, who was involved with Anthroposophy, an offshoot of Theosophy, started by Rudolf Steiner in 1912 in Switzerland, and is famous for its ongoing educational system, the Waldorf schools, and its agricultural theories in biodynamic farming, which closely tied the planting to the relation to the cycles of the moon and focused on our relationship with the spiritual beings inhabiting plants. Members of the Mason family were not only interested in anthroposophy, but also in optics, astronomy — they had a small observatory in their backyard — and co-masonry, which is a Masonic movement unlike the Grand Lodge of England. Co-masonry admits women on equal footing as men. Masonic movements which admit women are the majority worldwide, but you wouldn't necessarily know this living in England or in America. This is important and of personal interest to me, as I am a member of a Masonic order which admits men and women on equal footing. Now, the Mason family was wealthy and established enough to construct and dedicate a building to esoteric endeavor. They called this Beechwood Hall. The building was 20 by 30 feet, had windows on two sides, its own kitchen and bathroom. Beechwood served as the headquarters of a co-Masonic lodge named Harmony Lodge. Susie Mason was listed as the secretary of the local Theosophical Society. Her brother Ernie Mason was listed as having joined in 1915, with his sister Susie joining the following year. Their sister Rosetta Fudge was also a member of the lodge from 1924 to 1933. Rosetta was clearly interested in anthroposophy, having the first books by Rudolf Steiner translated into English in 1910. Harmony Lodge had a quite famous member, Annie Besant. Starting out life as an atheist, she became a student of Blavatsky in 1890. Besant became president of the Worldwide Theosophical Society in 1907, at that time headquartered in India. Annie was a socialist, co-Mason, women's rights activist, campaigner for Indian nationalism, and the author of a number of books on esoteric subjects such as the Bhagavad Gita, Lessons on Karma, Adivara's Thought Forms, Its Control in Culture, A Study in Consciousness, Thought Forms, Occult Chemistry, An Introduction to Yoga, Giordano Bruno, etc. Well, you get the idea. She was prosecuted in 1877 for publishing a book by a birth control campaigner. But beyond theosophy, Annie Besant also started the first co-Masonic lodge in England. Although she died in 1933 prior to Gerald moving to the area, I suspect that she had quite the influence on the lodge members and on the Mason family. For those who are unaware, Masonic bodies require for membership the acknowledgement of the existence of a supreme being called the Grand Architect of the universe, and leave the qualities of this being unarticulated, thereby allowing personal flexibility in interpretation. Masonic bodies generally don't discuss politics at lodge to dissuade conflict in the lodge. It's interesting that a political Masonic disagreement regarding the admission of atheists into the order caused Harmony Lodge to dissociate from the British Supreme Council of Co-Masonry, especially since Annie Besant at a young age claimed to be an atheist. As can be seen in parallel with present-day events, mainstream politics intersecting with esoteric work, causing a split, with these English co-Masons withdrawing from the larger international body. And as we know, however, the esoteric work carried on, and that's the important part. It appears that Ernie Mason is an interesting character in his own right. He was an engineer and chemist with an interest in astronomy. Rebuilding the observatory his father had constructed in the back garden, apparently Ernie made an 18-inch reflective telescope on his own, grinding the mirrors and completing the mirror finish. That's pretty impressive. He was a member of the Royal Astronomical Society, and it's noted by one of his friends that Ernie would teach, quote, mental exercises within a Rosicrucian context. Now, we don't know exactly what that means. His esoteric work appears to involve some type of chanting. All of his teachings were given free of charge. Ernie was reported to have telepathic abilities, to be able to materialize objects, see auras, change the weather, and walk on water. Pretty impressive, I would say. From my perspective, though, Ernie Mason thought of himself as a quote-unquote white witch, belonging to a, quote, white order, and that when he passed the power, he had to do so to a woman. According to Ernie, the power had to be passed man to woman and woman to man, exactly how it's done in traditional Gardnerian craft. So these important concepts and practices were in the esoteric landscape that Gerald was enmeshed in, and they are at the core of Gardnerian craft.
With all these influences and touch points then for Gardner, who actually initiated Gardner into Gardnerian craft?
Gerald's probable initiator in the craft was Edith Woodford Grimes, or Daffo as he called her. She was certainly described as adventurous by one of her relatives, and she lived in Baldon, a town of 6,000, where it just so happened that the head of a temple of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn resided, as well as a number of its members of that particular temple. We don't know if Edith had any acquaintance with any of these members, but it's certainly an interesting coincidence. One of the things we do know is that Daffo and Gerald had a long-standing relationship. It's speculated that it was probably romantic, and it certainly involved business dealings, as Edith was involved with Gerald's interest in the 5 Acre Sun Club after the war in the late 1940s. One of their common interests was their experience of being able to recall elements of past lives. It is speculated that Daffo worked with Gerald on the final manuscript of his novel A Goddess Arrives, which revolves around reincarnation as a central theme. Philip Heselton speculates that Gerald's acquaintance with these individuals in the New Forest influenced some of the esoteric elements included in the novel. There is no way to know for sure, however, as documented in Gerald Gardner Witch, it appears that other members of this group also experienced memories of past lives and of lives of being together as a group. This is the group who are called the, quote, New Forest Coven, from where Gerald's practices originates. How exactly they practiced we do not know. After all, what they were doing had been illegal for many decades. We only know what Gerald has mentioned. It's interesting, however, that Philip Heselton quotes a letter from Cecil Williamson, the owner-cooperator of the Witchcraft Museum, who writes of having met Edith Woodford Grimes during the Second World War when he was stationed in the New Forest with his army unit. She mentioned to him about the activities of her group, and that he, Williamson, also mentions he heard of 2 covens operating in the New Forest. Interesting stuff. I would say this because although I am Gardnerian, there were others at the time practicing what they called witchcraft, with sometimes very different worldviews and practices, while there were others with views and work more similar to Gerald. The cunningcraft traditions in England involved practitioners of folk magic in the local villages, and these practitioners were known to be able to both bless and blast, that is, to heal and curse. The worldview during the time and in that place was very black and white, so much so that practitioners might be called white witches or black witches depending upon whether they practiced malefic magic. This black-white worldview in the occult was certainly prominent through the 1960s. Some of these other schools might be called, quote, traditional witchcraft, as they involve satanic practices, while others might be called Luciferian, but discussing these streams are beyond the scope of this particular podcast. It should be said clearly that Gardnerian practice does not involve working with Satan, as we see this as following a Christian framework, which is at odds with our pagan outlook. But following Gerald's bursting on the scene, the esoteric world has not been the same since. Gerald was initiated a few days after the start of World War II in the Mill House, the home of Dorothy Clutterbuck, who is called Old Dorothy, where he first encountered the term Wica. Now it has been speculated that Old Dorothy was Gerald's initiator into the craft, but I believe that Philip Heselton, using information obtained by Doreen Valiente, who spoke with Gerald on these points, that Gerald was actually initiated by Daffo, Edith Woodford Grimes, and that the house was borrowed from Old Dorothy Clutterbuck for the purpose. And although Old Dorothy may not have been present at Gerald's initiation, her writing indicates she clearly had an affinity with nature and the world of fairy. Another member of the group that Gerald was socializing with was Rosamund Sabine, known as Mother Sabine. In 1905, she applied to be a member of the, quote, rectified rite, an offshoot of the Golden Dawn started by A.E. Waite after the collapse of the larger body. The original Golden Dawn was a Hermetic ceremonial magic group, which included Samuel Mathers, Aleister Crowley, Violet Firth, who you may know as Dion Fortune, and W.B. Yeats. The Golden Dawn, like co-masonry, accepted women on equal footing as men. This was unusual for the times. The rectified rite only lasted until 1915, when it was closed due to political infighting. She was certainly familiar enough with the Rose-Cross laymen of the Golden Dawn to write an article about it. This implies that she was initiate of some type of esoteric order. Rosamund Sabine had joined the Society for Psychical Research in 1900. This interest in esoteric work apparently followed through the rest of her life. She also seems to have had an interest in astrology. Rosamund lived very close to Highcliffe-on-Sea at the edge of the New Forest, and it is clear that Gerald had some level of contact with her, having inherited some of her herbal cabinets and a 1684 copy of Culpeper's Herbal following her death. I say these things because the esoteric world is very small. Even before the internet, everyone knew everyone else. These are small social circles. They were certainly much smaller in the 1930s, when most lived and died within a few miles of their birth. Gerald and Mother Sabine certainly lived close enough to each other. Back then, as today, there is often an overlapping interest in the esoteric. It would not have been unusual to be interested in theosophy, co-masonry, folklore, and magic, and participate in the activities of a few groups at the same time. The same is true today, where you meet different folks at a meetup or a moot, for example, share ideas, theories, and practices on the esoteric, and then introduce those who you think are compatible to social circles where they would be welcomed. Interestingly, the Sabines owned a rather substantial house with a large, secluded garden. I can tell you from personal experience that it's possible to hold sky-clad gatherings in a private, well-sculpted garden located in suburban Philadelphia, with homes closer than you think. If it is possible in this day and age, I have no doubt it would have been possible for the Sabines to hold gatherings on their property, should they have chosen. As has been remarked by Gareth Medway, it is odd that such a small place as Highcliffe and Christchurch turned out to be a hotbed of the esoteric. As he states, quote, "Within a few miles there were astrologers, spiritual healers, Rosicrucians, the Order of Melchizedek, a spiritualist mission, and a witch coven," unquote. We don't know why Highcliffe ended up being such a magnet for those interested in the esoteric. It certainly was, and is, a favored place to retire, given its location between the coast and the forest. It could have been chance which favored this constellation of personalities and interests, or, if you believe in the gods, it may have been fate. But this is where Gerald found the Wica. From what Gerald has written, it appears that there was a, quote, old coven established in the area. We would have expected that they were below ground, so to speak, as their activities would have been illegal in the recent past. As the nature of the esoteric, however, those with unusual interests and who ask questions deeper than the mainstream tend to find each other.
When Gerald found the Wica, was it a group of individuals who had these differing interests, such as theosophy and co-masonry, as you mentioned, or were they different people? Where did they come from?
In one of Gerald's articles, New Light on Witchcraft, he quoted people that he knows who speak of their grandparents telling them of having attended meetings over 100 years prior. We now know that Gerald has stated that he came from a hereditary coven. Who these hereditary witches were exactly, we don't know. It could have been members of the Mason family. It could have been his initiator. It could have been Rosamund Sabine, as Philip Heselton has suggested. Gerald maintained that the witches he knew spoke of family magical activities, such as dissuading Bonaparte from invading England in 1803-1804. This hereditary part is important because it speaks to the importance of family, passing down information and knowledge from generation to generation. In fact, it is the passing down of working knowledge and information, doing things and knowing why you are doing them, that constitutes tradition. I say this to contrast it with custom. A custom is where we do things, but we don't know why we do them. Tradition can move to a custom and move back again if the understanding is recovered. or a tradition is born if a new understanding is used to organize the practice of the group. Now, Gerald was certainly a controversial figure. He finds this group, becomes initiated into the Wica, and in his enthusiasm immediately wants to start to publicize it. He wanted to write books and later give interviews, this on a topic which was recently illegal. The people he associated with were certainly not shy, but they didn't want their activities broadcast to where they would be attracting unwanted attention. When he proposed this, it was initially rejected, but he was permitted to first write about the craft in a fictional form, in High Magic's Aid, his novel, and he was finally allowed to write nonfiction accounts in Witchcraft Today, published in 1954, and The Meaning of Witchcraft, published in 1959. For those interested in Gardnerian craft, there is no better place to start than these two works. Nothing is wasted. I often recommend, when starting to study the craft, that you read them. After you become initiated, read them again. If you are elevated, read them again. Gerald hides gems in plain sight. For example, in The Meaning of Witchcraft, gems are scattered, placed in the middle of a paragraph, and then Gerald moves on as if they were of no consequence. This is Gerald's style, hiding things in plain sight, just as he talks about witch beliefs by putting them in the words of Morven and High Magic's Aid. One of the frequent mistakes I see initiates make is to read these works once when they are training and to never pick them up again. They are well worth referring back to. That said, we know that Gerald's likely initiator was not pleased with his activities publicizing the craft and the people he chose to bring in. Gerald often initiated people through his intuitive sense of fit for the craft. Actually, the word he used was not fit, it was sympathy, a wonderfully magical term with an interesting occult pedigree. Far be it from me to criticize Gerald's decisions, and while I understand his motivation in wanting to rescue what he saw as a dying cult from extinction, using intuition to guide major decisions can be useful. It can also lead to dreadful mistakes. Gerald certainly made dreadful mistakes in initiating people who were unsavory and who brought negative publicity on the craft, most likely alienating his initiator and past colleagues.
On that note, we will end Part 1 of this episode, Understanding Gerald Gardner. In Part 2, we will discuss traditional Gardnerian Wicca beliefs and tenets, which continues our conversation with High Priest O'Loran. Thank you for listening, and we hope you have enjoyed this podcast.